Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, PowHer and Time's Up, for coordinating this really all-star lineup. So many of my friends and colleagues are on the line presenting, and I'm sure joining in as well, and it's an honor to be with you all. I wanted to take us back just a little bit because the history of this extends far beyond the past 2 years, obviously. And the New York City Commission on Human Rights, where I work, is the city agency that enforces our local New York City human rights law. So we've been talking a lot about the New York State human rights law, but there's also a local New York City human rights law. And the City Commission, the agency that enforces that law, has been really for decades now at the forefront of the fight to address and combat sexual harassment in the workplace. So if we go to the next slide. So in 1975, our former commissioner, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is now the congresswoman representing the District of Columbia in Congress, held one of the first hearings, public hearings on sexual harassment in the workplace. And out of that hearing, it is what we understand to be the first time that the term sexual harassment was publicly reported, and it was in the New York Times. And I find it interesting that it was kind of buried on page 38 of the Family and Life section, but here we are. And the quote here and the article itself could have just as easily been written in 1995 or 2005 or 2015 or even today, because I think the themes, the experiences are so consistent across the decades, despite a lot of progress that we have made and we continue to make in this space. We all know that this is, in many ways, an intractable problem that we are using now as many tools at our disposal to address. So if we move on to the next slide. So the standard in New York City has been a model for the past 10 years around what it means to engage in unlawful sexual harassment in the workplace. The New York City human rights law includes a provision that was passed in 2005, similar to a provision that is now in state law, as Miriam described, that informs judges and lawyers that the city human rights law must be interpreted broadly, it must be construed broadly, so that protections are considered broadly to effectuate its remedial purpose. So very similar language that's now in the state law. And in 2009, a state court interpreting the New York City human rights law did away with explicitly the severe or pervasive standard so that even a single comment that objectifies women made in circumstances where that comment would, for example, signal views about the role of women in the workplace may be actionable. And the defense to that is it must be more than petty slights or trivial inconveniences. So for the past 10 years, we have been operating under a legal standard that has done away in New York City with severe or pervasive and looks at sexual harassment like any other form of discrimination. If you are being treated less well than because of your gender, and it could manifest in the form of comments, of emails, of unwanted touching, of flirtation, and in a whole host of ways, then that is unlawful sexual harassment under the New York City human rights law. And I just want to also flag that because sexual harassment is like any other form of gender discrimination, that applies in other circumstances as well. So race-based harassment is a form of race discrimination, and harassment based on one's disability is a form of disability discrimination. So this cuts across all of our protected categories, of which there are many. And I also just want to flag, too, that while we often use the term sexual harassment, in the city, we're trying to move away to refer to it as gender-based harassment because our protection stems from protections based on gender. And gender under the New York City human rights law has been broadly defined since 2002 to include gender identity and gender expression. And And so sexual harassment can be, harassment based on one's nonconformance with gender stereotypes, around one's gender identity, around one's sexual orientation, and it can include harassment that is, men harassing men, a woman harassing a man, obviously a man harassing a woman. It cuts across all different sort of dynamics. And while we do see most of our cases at the city level involving men as the harasser, we also see a significant minority of our cases are male victims, and it's most frequently, again, male harassers. So that really does involve men who are not, in many cases, who are not conforming to sort of these stereotypes around how a man should behave. And that may imply notions around sexual orientation or, again, gender identity or gender stereotypes. But this is what we see across some of our cases. So we often like to take the sexual term out because that implies some kind of sexual attraction or and that is really not the limiting principle here, but that it can involve a whole host of different characteristics that are actual or perceived that may result in harassing behavior. So if we just go to the next slide. So I just wanted to run through a bit of the recent history at the city level, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. So some of those high-profile stories hit the news in October of 2017. In December of 2017, the Commission hosted a public hearing on sexual harassment in the workplace, which was our first public hearing since Commissioner Eleanor Holmes Norton held public hearings many decades ago. That hearing had about 40 different people testify, either in person or by submitting testimony. And again, we heard from many of our partner organizations about how sexual harassment cuts across industry, identity, how it impacts women of color at higher rates than white women, how it impacts LGBTQIA workers at higher rates than cisgender and straight identifying workers. And we really wanted to highlight those voices because we felt like the narrative at the time really focused on those high-profile cases and sort of well-resourced people. In spring 2018, we issued our report, which had a host of recommendations. In spring 2018, we implemented the Stop Sexual Harassment in NYC Act, which included some of the changes that are now happening at the state level. There is a 4-employee minimum at the city level for claims of discrimination and harassment. That was reduced to 1 last year for gender-based harassment. So while it is that minimum is being reduced more broadly at the state level, currently right now, small employers, domestic workers have rights under the city law with respect to gender-based harassment. Our statute of limitations was also extended from 1 year to 3 years to file at the Commission. Again, as Senator Biaggi had recognized, it is a very short window of time to navigate filing a claim. So now it's 3 years to file at the Commission. And it also, the bill package included training requirements and posting requirements. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll wrap up. In 2019, early 2019, we launched our gender-based harassment unit, which is a small unit focused in our law enforcement bureau with attorneys and investigators who only address gender-based harassment cases. They have a specialty in that area. And then on April 1st, 2019, the Commission launched what we believe is the first of its kind online interactive anti-sexual harassment training that has now, I can tell you now, it's been completed over 200,000 times, and it's now up in 10 languages and has been completed several hundred times in every single language, with Spanish being completed over 10,000 times. And that is the online training that you can use, employers can use to meet both the state training requirement and the city training requirement. Both the New York City and New York State pass training requirements, but this online training, which is available on our website, can be used once a year to meet that training requirement. And as I said, the training has now been completed over 200,000 times. Just
That's
to
amazing,
close,
Dana.
oh, thanks. And just to close, I will say that, you know, our claims of sexual harassment in the workplace more than doubled in a single year from, if we look at the calendar year 2017 to calendar year 2018, and the claims coming to the Commission continue to grow. And we are looking at, you know, broad and remedial enforcement, mandating systemic change in workplaces that had no policies, that had no training, that need to raise standards across the board, and ensuring that people receive damages for the emotional harm they endured if they were forced to leave the job, back pay, front pay if they are continuing to look for a job, and civil penalties and fines that would be paid to the City of New York. These cases can be challenging, but we encourage that people, challenging in the sense that it may take, you know, time for the Commission to investigate and prosecute, but we encourage people to continue to come to our agency and see us as a resource, both to learn what their rights are, for employers to learn what their obligations are, and for people to understand what their rights are and to realize the breadth of their rights under the local law. So thank you again, and thank you again for coordinating this important conversation.
Thank you, Dana, for sharing the experience of New York City.